being here. And thank you to the organization, our organization, Women's Voices Now, for giving us this platform to speak on this very important topic. I want to start this panel by asking our wonderful filmmaker, Dia, what inspired you to make this film about domestic violence and to explore the motivations behind male perpetrators, this particular perspective? What inspired you?
Thank you so much for having me. It was such an honor to be here with Alex and Leslie. And thank you, Yasmin, and thank you, Women's Voices Now, for hosting this, and everyone for joining us. So I have been involved in women's rights activism for a very long time. And within that, a very specific and issue close to my heart has been violence against women. And I have been frustrated for a very long time in terms of how this issue is framed within our society, where often the questions will be things like, why is she with somebody like this? Why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't she report him? Why does she pull the charges? Why? And I wanted to make this film because I wanted to reframe the conversation and lift the responsibility and the accountability where it belongs, which is the actual question we need to be asking as a society is, why does he do it in the first place? So in order to explore that, I wanted to get closer to the mindset and the psychology of what is it that lies behind the perpetrator who not only is emotionally abusive or financially abusive, but also chooses to use violence against, a partner that he claims to love. And I've done films in the past about other forms of violence, more public violence, including terrorism. And what's always stood out to me about this form of intimate violence is that the perpetrator knows his victim. He often has children with his victim. He often hugs and shares the same bed with this person. So how does somebody hold these two things to be true and still be able to exert such incredible brutality?
And throughout the film, we watched very challenging moments. And I just wonder how that was for you. And was there any, as a filmmaker, was there any moment that you felt like you might need to stop, like that you couldn't do this, and what kept you moving forward? Especially when you're speaking to people who've killed their partners, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
So it was very hard. So practically speaking, it was a hard film to make because it was really hard to get anyone to agree to speak in the film at all. So I tried and tried and tried for months. And in the end, actually, the film ended up taking about 1.5 years to make from the point that I decided to actually make it. And the reason for that was that the level of stigma and shame that surrounds this issue, not just on the end of survivors and victims, but also on the side of the perpetrator. Very few men and perpetrators want to put their hand up and say, I am that guy. I am the guy who does this to my loved one. So to get somebody to speak out publicly and not blurring their faces, not changing their voices was really important for me, because I wanted to have an up close and personal face-to-face conversation and for the viewers to be able to have that experience with me. So that was, practically speaking, very hard. Emotionally, it was very difficult. And it was difficult because obviously listening to incredible violence and dehumanization that happened on the part of the perpetrator towards their partners. And so to hear also some of the men minimizing, sometimes excusing, sometimes wanting to center their own trauma and not acknowledging the reality of what they put their partner through was very difficult. And as I said, being a women's rights activist and having friends who have had some of these experiences as well, and some family members too, it's very hard to sit and listen at times, to be quite honest. Having said that, My primary purpose for making the film is for us as individuals and as a society to respond in a way that is more productive, to find better solutions, and to not just hide women from their abusers, but, as I say, to interrupt the pattern and the process of abuse itself and the violence itself. So in order to do that, that kept me in the project. In order to get to the solutions, we have to listen to the perpetrator. We have to get to some of the needs and some of the dynamics of what's really going on within him for us to find accurate solutions.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And speaking of people telling their stories, Leslie, I'd love to ask you, what inspired you? What made you say yes to share your story?
So when I originally started writing Crazy Love, I did it mostly out of anger. I was so angry that people blamed victims for staying. And some of the smartest, most thoughtful people I knew would ask, why doesn't she just leave? Domestic violence victims are weak and powerless, and they have no self-esteem. And I wanted to explain to people that it has nothing to do with self-esteem and that everybody is vulnerable. And so in my book, I wanted people to really feel what it was like to fall in love with somebody who is intent upon killing you, and how hard it is to leave and how much help you need to leave. So that's what got me to writing Crazy Love. And then I unexpectedly became an advocate. I didn't realize that people were going to want to hear the story too, in addition to reading it. And so by the time it came around for me to talk to Dia for this movie, I was all in. I believe that there are a couple of messages that are critical that Dia addresses, and it's why I was so excited to work on this movie and to be in it. The first is that everyone is vulnerable to abuse. That we like to think that it happens to other people who are not like us in some way, but it's just wrong. It happens to everybody. You know, I'm a Harvard and Wharton graduate, and my husband was too, and just happens everywhere. Second, this is a men's issue. And that's what Dia is really getting at in this movie. And that we are never going to end abuse if we don't get men the help that they need and hold them accountable. And it is completely unfair. And it's just wrong that our society expects women to be the ones to end this and to work on it, you know, endlessly, to get men to open up and to get them to stop. This is a men's issue, and they are responsible. When I watched this movie, I feel the same way I did when Dia asked me to be part of it. I don't feel that it's painful to watch it. I feel like it's exhilarating to watch it, because we are finally getting inside men's heads about why they hurt women who they love. And it's a terrifying look. I mean, the thing that struck me the most watching the movie this time was the lack of voluntary introspection from men about why they do this. Men who have tortured, almost killed, even killed their wives. It's very rare for men, even in that circumstance, to think about why they're doing it. And that's why it's so important to break the silence. We have got to get men thinking about this. Men who commit abuse, men who witness abuse, men who are bystanders, men who deny that abuse happens. We have to get them to realize that what they are doing is abusive, and that it has to stop, that it's hurting the women in our society, but it's hurting our whole society, and it's hurting them too.
Thank you so much for that, Leslie. And we'll get back. I have a good question to go off on that. Before that, I want to ask an incredible man who's joining us on the panel, or who's joined us, Alex. I want to ask you, speaking to men about this issue and this being a men's issue, what inspired you to do the work that you do today and to be an activist? And also fill us in on what are some common reactions or answers that you get from men that you talk to about domestic violence.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and be part of this powerful film. You know, what brought me to my activism, it's been an interesting journey over the last nine years. My first connection here was through what happened to my daughter. My daughter, Chessie Prout, was sexually assaulted while a freshman at St. Paul's School as part of a ritualized game that some young men were playing to see how many young people they could score before they graduated school. And so it was very much a personal effort to look after my daughter to make sure she survived what happened to her. Then afterwards, I saw how society and our culture treated victims of violence and how they isolate them, they shame them, they blame them. And the perpetrators are labeled as, good guys who have just possibly done something wrong, but everyone assumes it's the other person's fault. So many of these themes sort of resonated to me. But it took me a long time because we've been doing activism work. My first part of my own healing journey was speaking and raising awareness, but I was speaking to the choir, I was speaking to women, I was speaking to survivors, I was speaking to advocates. And I needed to get some soul-searching mentoring from a good friend of mine, Don McPherson, to learn how do I speak to young men about this? Because my instinct, if I was going to speak to a young man, would be to scream at him, "Don't rape." And I'd probably be standing there with a baseball bat behind my back. And I had to go, I knew that wasn't productive, but with the socially constructed definition of masculinity that I was confined by, that's what I felt my duty was as a man to do. And then I had an epiphany that we needed to reach our young men if we're going to solve this problem, if we're going to address it. And I needed to bring other men into the conversation. And of course, I learned that from a woman or women. And my wife was speaking at the Holton Arms School here in Washington, D.C., and talking about sexual assault awareness, consent. And the girls snapped their fingers, and then they said, "You're speaking to us, but are you speaking to the boys' schools in DC?" And that was an aha moment. And we said, we need to do this. And I said, I need to be part of that. And we need this to help our young people, because our young people don't want to be destructive. They don't want to be violent, but they are confined and they don't hear alternatives, especially from men, about how to connect more with their feelings. And I love this film. I'm so motivated to introduce this to schools, to open up conversations, because I know through our work, every time a survivor speaks up, it encourages other survivors to speak up. And I'm so hopeful that this film, hearing men be vulnerable and speaking up about why they do these terrible things, will connect with other men and give them the motivation to speak up and maybe seek help.
Thank you so much for that history into how you got into this. And I would really like to know can you give us sort of an idea when you speak to these men, what responses they have or what they say or what's the most surprising to you or what's the most common?
Well, I can't imagine how much patience Dia has in her journey of making this film, and for Leslie for all the courageous advocacy she's done over the years. My first time I spoke with a group of boys on this topic, they knew I was a father of a survivor. Their first question to me was, they wanted to know about false reporting. And I needed to explain to these young men the data and the statistics. I needed, first of all, not to react. And I needed to give them the data so they could be well armed. And I explained to them, you're about 6 times more likely to be sexually assaulted and be a victim of sexual violence than you are to be falsely accused. And to their credit, the young man immediately said, I had no idea the prevalence of violence in our society, gender-based violence. This will forever alter how I speak to other people and the kind of jokes I make. So I think first and foremost, you need to have patience in this work, especially engaging with men, because there's so many tropes that are out there. Leslie listed several in terms of the reactions that victims of violence face. And I've seen it all through my daughter's experience in speaking to hundreds of survivors since. So we need to break down these tropes and then connect to people as human beings. I believe all of us at our core, I grew up half Japanese, half Irish American. I've grown up in different cultures. I've had to learn from the earliest days that to believe in the commonality of humanity and not focus on our differences. I believe all of us, and I think one of the brave men speaking in the movie, was talking about he wasn't born violent, he wasn't born angry. And when we look at the box that men are asked to be, placed in, where you can only show 30-40% of who you are, we need to work with young men especially to start connecting them with what they know inside. We speak to middle schoolers and high schoolers. The middle schoolers are the most beautiful people in the world. They're open, they're engaging. By the time we get to high schoolers, especially seniors, they're the bros sitting in the back, and they're preparing themselves for what they feel the real world is. And we try to explain to them the real world is love. The real world is being productive in a team environment in the workplace. The real world is building a family and finding a partner. So we've polluted the minds of especially our young men, about what it means to be a quote unquote man. And that's the work that we do every day.
Thank you so much. And then I have a question for anyone who'd like to answer on the panel. There are so many ways to talk about this issue, to address this issue. How do you feel you spoke a little bit to this, Alex, but maybe from Leslie or Dia, you guys can chime in. What do you think is the most effective way to deal with this issue? Is it's education, like Alex said, speaking to the younger boys? What about people who have already committed gender-based violence? What's the best way, or the most effective way that you've seen?
I'm interested in what Dia has to say, but I'll take my answer first. The thing that I find so amazing about abuse and unhealthy relationships is how extraordinarily effective it is to talk when you talk about it. There are very few standard social ills that you can really start solving just by talking about it, but this is one of them. And so, that's why I speak out. It's why I speak out on social media. It's why I tell my story. Because when people hear somebody speaking honestly about what they've been through, whether you're a victim, it doesn't matter if it was emotional abuse, sexual assault, physical violence, just by owning your own victimhood and the fact that you survived it, it's really important. And also a perpetrator who speaks out. I think that's why I find the film so exhilarating, is that it's perpetrators trying to explain why they did what they did without wanting to be excused for it. I think this is how we're going to end it, is by speaking out and raising awareness.
Thank you, Leslie.
I'm very, very touched by what Alex was saying, and Leslie, I completely agree with you. I think just putting more light on it really helps, and not keeping it inside and it just being something that's brushed aside. I think also I think we need a culture where violence isn't tolerated, and I think we have to ensure that respect and equality and also empathy become ingrained in our societal values. And in terms of what we need to do longer term, I do think that it involves education. I think it involves challenging harmful stereotypes. I think we have to foster an environment where everyone feels empowered to speak out, as Leslie's saying, against violence and against. I think, and Alex was touching on this earlier, I think one of the core issues here, I think, is men and boys are given a very narrow space within which they can be a human being. So I feel men are being dehumanized. It's only somebody who is dehumanized who is capable of dehumanizing other people. And the way young men and boys are being dehumanized is they're not allowed to express their full humanity. That they're only allowed to feel certain emotions, like anger, like aggression, and not any of the vulnerable emotions, like Dr. Jackson Katz also says in the film. And I think we have to liberate young men to get comfortable with being a full human being. of what that actually means, the entirety of what it means to be a human being. And we're seeing young men flocking to people like the Andrew Tates and other figures like that, because I think our young men and boys in particular, I think, have a lot of questions about how they fit in to this newer society, this newer expression of equality and inclusivity. And so where does that leave them? And I think we have to somehow bring them with us, and we have to support them in this transition, because the questions that they have are legitimate, important questions. The answers that they're getting are not particularly useful or productive, but that says something about us as a society as much as it says something about Andrew Tate, for example. So I think education and having these open conversations, I think, is absolutely crucial. And while we ensure that we support young women, and that it's not young women's responsibility to manage and deal with the lack of, or these destructive ways of expressing emotions on the part of their partners. So I think masculinity and what it means to be a man has to be explored in depth.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. So we've been moved by your answers, by your film, and sometimes, while we may agree with everything, people walk out of things. They're like, okay, what's next? What do we do now? What can I do to help? So what would be your call to action? What would be your call to action for people to leave today from watching this interview? What would you say for somebody to do today or this week or this, moving forward to end this kind of violence and this kind of abuse?
Are you asking all of us or just me?
Yeah, no, all of you.
Okay. Well, I'll let the others go first.
I'm ready. Two very simple things. One is that if you have been the victim of any sort of abuse, including sexual assault, I just want you to know that it is not your fault. And I want you to tell yourself that every single day. It was not your fault. There was nothing that you did that caused this. The second thing is that if anybody ever, if you're in the privileged position of somebody coming to you and saying, my boyfriend hits me, my mother hits me, my father hits me, somebody sexual assaulted me, believe them. There will be plenty of time, trust me, if they're lying, for their story to fall apart. But it's very, very rare that people lie about these things. And so believe them. It's incredibly important to believe victims. So I think that those are two things that are hard to do, but are really simple and extremely powerful.
Well, I will jump in. I think what is clear here is we need a call to action for men. I think we all understand from hearing from people in this documentary that this is a men's issue. I think that needs to be just accepted by all. I think it also needs to be accepted that men have created a lot of the structures that have allowed this this gender-based violence issue to reach the extent that it exists today. We see the impact through the men speaking in the documentary of drugs, of alcohol, of other trauma in their past life impacting them. And there are two alternatives available to us, right? As men, we can either help these men with their struggles, or we can watch them grasp for power and control and enable them to continue with our silence. And I think we need to acknowledge as men that the accountability or the lack thereof is built by us in terms of the systems that we put into place. And this is the ultimate privilege of men that we've done for ourselves. But this is self-destructive to men as well. We've seen that powerfully depicted in this movie. These men want to escape this. And that's the power in the message, the beauty of this film from my perspective. They don't want this privilege. They want the help and the support. And if we're not providing it, we're being complicit. So what can men do? We can model simple things, dads. We can model being vulnerable, talking to our kids about what it was like, what healthy relationships are like, what it was like the first time you met your mom, what it felt like to hold her hand for the first time, and connect with our kids to show them in real life examples, not just with our words, but with how we behave. This is the most powerful thing we can do.
Is there pulling from the chat and the audience? Is there language that you can suggest that we can use when speaking to men about this? Is there language not to use? Do you have just a few examples you can give us?
Well, I'll jump in there. I learned from a good friend, again, Don McPherson, not to use the word toxic masculinity. So we've deleted it from all of our presentations.
That's a good point.
Because he told me quite wisely that this will turn off men because they will feel like they're being attacked. And so we've come up with a new term, again, developed by a very brilliant woman, not myself. We refer to it as socially constructed masculinity. And I think that is much more actually an accurate depiction as well, because the definition that are confining men in now is something that has been constructed by our culture. And if it's created by our culture, we can shift that definition. And I think Dia gave such a wonderful description of what men can be aspirationally.
So from toxic masculinity to socially constructed masculinity, that's the shift in the language that you find most effective. Thank you so much for that.
May I add to that? I completely agree. I'm so glad you said that, Alex. I used to say toxic masculinity as well. And I just noticed anytime I would speak in a room and there would be men in the room, I would see them, and even men who were allies and who understand a lot of these issues, they would turn off. Because I think to very many men, and especially young men, toxic masculinity sounds like inherently there's something toxic about being a man. And that's obviously not what we're talking about, but that's what it sounds like, and that's what's received. For me, it's crucial as a filmmaker to tell stories in a way that allows for people to be open and be able to hear what's being said, because especially in the time that we're living in now, people don't want to listen to each other. People's walls and barriers come up very, very easily. And what I found is that, speaking about what we have in common, as Alex said earlier, is absolutely necessary. So starting with our humanness and the messiness of what it is to be a human being, I think is a good way to start. And I think it's very important to call out men's violence, but I think you don't have to be judgmental. I think, sort of the basic principles of having dialogue or conversation where people are able to be themselves, you have to put your judgment aside. There's nothing wrong in being respectful. You can agree, you can disagree, respectfully. And I think speaking more to what you think that they can be rather than where they are. So I think telling them that that they're better than that, and that that they have the capacity for change, I think is really a helpful way of sort of approaching people if you have very profound differences with each other. But, my call to action, I think, actually would relate to this, is I think if you can try to be someone that either a woman in need of support can approach if she needs help. And I think for men in your life, I think try to be someone safe that they can talk to, and that they can actually be open and honest and say the things that they are curious or ask the questions that they have, and try to walk together in exploring those questions. Because I think if we just put up walls, we all lose truly at the end of that. So the reality is, whether it's this issue or it's any of the other issues that are going on in our world right now, the reality is we have to coexist. And the reality is violence is not the answer. Because violence eventually ends. So what do we do after the violence? So rather than destroying as many lives as are being destroyed by violence of all forms at this point, including in our homes, we need to learn how to speak to each other, and we need to learn how to deal with our differences, how to deal with our emotions, so that we don't harm each other or ourselves. You look at male suicide in this country, and it is incredible the high numbers of that. So something clearly is going on. So we need to make it safe and okay for people to engage with each other. Rather than taking topics off the table, we need to put it on the table and say, let's do this. We have to do this together. We're in this together. So I think some compassion and some openness is important, while, sticking to our principles, while sticking to our values, obviously. Both are possible to keep at the same time.
Absolutely. And Leslie wrote in the chat, if you're not looking at the chat, to go out and talk to everybody in your life about this discussion today. Share. That's a great way to begin opening up this subject and creating safe spaces within your community. And I just wanted to thank you all for being here. To everyone who attended this event, thank you to the panelists. Thank you so much for your insight, for your activism. Thank you for the film. You can check out each one of these incredible panelists' work online. I encourage everybody to go watch Leslie's TED Talk. It really gives extra to her perspective and her activism. I encourage you all to visit Dia's website and check out all of the incredible work that she's doing, all the other films that she's working on, and to check out Alex's organization and check out the work that he's doing. So please don't let this end right now. We're going to end this conversation right now, but please don't let it end within your communities and in your world. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of Women's Voices Now, everybody, for being here today. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everybody at Women's Voices Now. You all do great work.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you. And thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody. This is so touching. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Take care.